Well, again, good morning. I think this morning I'd like to jump right in to the gospel scene because I think it's there in the gospel that we see this beautiful story unfolding between two people, Simon and Peter. We find ourselves today in the 14th chapter of the Gospel of Matthew, this very familiar story of Peter walking on the water, but perhaps the story of Peter walking on the water started around that same body of water when Jesus saw Simon. It's been said that when Jesus first saw Simon, that he saw Peter in Simon. And it took 3 years for Jesus to pull Peter out of Simon. In the early laps around Matthew, when Jesus saw a fisherman tending his nets, we have to believe today that when Jesus saw the fisherman, Jesus saw the Pope inside the fisherman. And in 3 years of ministry, Jesus pulled the Pope out the fisherman. When God created Simon, he saw then in that moment as he crafted his soul together and blew his vocation into his heart, that very moment, God always knew who Simon would become. And as Jesus gazed upon the fisherman, when Jesus gazed upon Simon, he knew what was there. And perhaps what we celebrate more than wind and water and walking on the waves today is the beginning of an unfolding story inside the gospel where Jesus is pulling Peter out of Simon. Every one of us, you might say, is Simon. And every one of us, you might say, has a Peter inside of our Simon. And this morning, I believe that Almighty God Himself is looking at every one of us. And in some way, perhaps God is asking us the same question. Are you ready for God to give birth to Peter from your Simon? Are you ready for God to help you take that next step? Are you ready for God to reach inside your heart and allow who He created to be at the beginning of your conception, the person, the saint, the leader, the disciple? Are you ready to take that step where God can pull Peter out of your Simon? I want you to pause just for a second. And I want you to think about what your life would look like, just for a moment, if you allowed God to work in your life in such a powerful and miraculous and transformational way that He actually was able to allow the person who He created, all of your potential, all of what's possible in you and God, to come for fruition. For example, for those of you who are married, do you think you would be a better or worse spouse if you were Peter rather than Simon? Would it be easier for you as a spouse if you were married to Peter, you might say, rather than Simon? And if Peter represents all of our potential, and if Simon represents who we are in our ordinary way, we have to believe that that's possible. I can see it in your eyes right now. We are saying to ourselves, well, I'm just an ordinary person from a simple town in South Louisiana. We are no more ordinary than the ordinary fisherman from a small town in Israel called Nazareth. You might be saying to yourself, well, Father Mark, there's all kinds of reasons why I can't be Peter. There's all kinds of reasons why I should just stay Simon. And Peter himself had all of those excuses. And so I ask you again, would your marriage be better if you were married to Peter rather than Simon? If you yourself as a spouse were Peter rather than Simon? For those of you who are parents, Do you think your children's lives would be greater impacted or less impacted if you were Peter rather than Simon? Your family, would it be stronger or weaker if you allowed God to pull the Peter out of the Simon? Our church family here at the cathedral, would we be a stronger, more vibrant light to the world if we were all open to what God could do in our life to pull the Peter out of the Simon? I have to believe that the reason why you came to Mass today, I have to believe that there is a part of all of us that longs for God to do what we know He can. And yet what I know to be true about me is that it's more comfortable just being Simon. It's more comfortable just being a fisherman. And just for a moment, I would like for us to have the courage to peer into the whispers of our hearts and listen to perhaps all the reasons why it's easier for us to watch the gospel unfold today from the sidelines, and why it might be easier for us to dismiss the fact that God actually might be looking at all of us wanting to pull Peter out of Simon, and it would just be easy for us to say, you know what, Lord, not now. Perhaps you're hearing the voice of your past. I got to be honest with you and say that when I look at my past, I see much more straying off the path than staying on the path. I think I am very aware of my sin. I'm aware of how my sin has affected my life and the lives of others, and I'm fully aware of the litany of things that I haven't done. When I look at my past, I think it's easy for a lot of us to look at our past and to see our past as a sum of our failure. And when we see our sin, we see ourselves as sinners. And perhaps those very familiar words of Simon himself, the first time that he saw Jesus. What did Simon say? He said, "Depart from me, Lord, for I am a sinful man." Simon, aware of his sin, aware of Jesus' holiness, saw his life in light of his sin rather than Jesus' holiness, and his words out of his mouth was, just depart from me, Lord. I cannot be who you might call me to be because I am a sinner. And if those are the voices that whisper to you when you hear the voice of the Lord calling you to be Peter, my question for us today is your sin greater than His call? Is your sin greater than His mercy? Is your sin greater than His power? Is your sin greater than Jesus Christ? Is the one who's calling us to be Peter unaware of our sin? Of course, when Jesus called Simon, He knew that he was a sinner. Perhaps it was because of His humility that He called him. That for whatever reason, Jesus knows everything already. It's not like when Jesus calls the Peter out of you, He's going to get a little scandalized, a little surprised by our sin. Of course He knows that. And so let the voice of our past and let the voice of our no, let the excuses because of our sin meet the great power of Jesus Christ today. And in that place, Jesus is still calling Peter out of your Simon. For some of us, it's not our past. For some of us, it might just be our present moment. And I speak specifically to those of us who are aware that it's the middle of August. And I think, just to name what might be around us in Cajun country in the middle of August, is the residual effects of the slow fade. What's the slow fade? Well, the slow fade starts at Easter. In other words, when it's Ash Wednesday and you and I are charging into Lent with our hearts wide open and ashes on our forehead, when you and I in the early days of Lent are giving our hearts to the Lord, when we are begging Him, as we do on Ash Wednesday, to create a clean heart in us. A lot of us have spiritual momentum in Lent. And with the daily discipline of our Lenten penance, with the spiritual exercise, with the fervor that is afresh during Lent, it's easy for us to go week after week and go into Holy Week with an openness of heart, with a closeness to the Lord, with a momentum in our spiritual life. And as we move into Easter Sunday, what can often enter into our life is what I call the great exhale. It's Easter. I can relax a little bit. And all that I was committed to in my Lenten penance, I let go on Easter Sunday with a little indulgence and just a great exhale. And what happens is, if we're not careful, we turn around and it's Mother's Day and there's more of life going on. It's the end of school. There's a whole lot going on there. It's the first wave around the track with vacation in June. It's trips to the camp. There might be the occasional trip to Disney World. And whether we know it or not, it just kind of slips in there with a fishing trip here and a camping trip there. We kind of miss Mass one Sunday. We're not as attentive to Mass on one Sunday. June turned into July and the 4th of July, and more vacation, more time at the camp, more time away. And all of a sudden you find yourself kind of stumbling into the first week of school, which we just had last week, and you find yourself today, in the middle of August, looking back on Lent and asking, what happened to the fervor that I once had? It just seems like it faded slowly. And so many of us find ourselves listening to the invitation today with lots of reasons why we can't be Peter. It's because we flirted with him during Lent, and now we feel much more like Simon when we do like Peter. And if you are suffering from the slow fade, I just want to say, welcome back. When God called you on Ash Wednesday, He knew exactly where you would be on the middle of August today. When He called you on the first Sunday of Lent, He knew where you would be on the 19th Sunday of Ordinary Time. God is very familiar with the slow fade. He is not scandalized by the slow fade. He is the one who is reaching out to you. For if you have ever faded in your life, so did Peter. Hot and cold. Throughout the Gospels, what do we see from Simon? What do we see from Peter? This hot and cold, back and forth, close and far away relationship with Jesus Christ. And if you are suffering from the slow fade, I declare to you today that Jesus is still calling you. He still has His eyes on your Peter. And the question today is, are you ready in the present moment to let Him take you deeper? Or perhaps the voices of excuse, of all the reasons why you can't be Peter, why it's just more comfortable to be Simon, is because when you look at the future, you're just afraid. What might happen if you went all the way? And perhaps it's that whisper that is most seducing us to play it safe, to stay on the sideline. I can just tell you this, that while our future might be unknown, I can only tell you that He can be trusted. While our future might be unknown, Jesus only wants what is best for you. While your future might be unknown, what He had in store for Peter changed his life, and I might even say changed the world. So whether our excuses today are rooted in our past, whether our excuses of today are rooted in our present, whether the voices of no and the excuses that we have are rooted in the fear of our future, I just simply say to us that Jesus Christ right now is knocking on the door of your heart right now. There's a line in the sand. He's looking at you. He's staring at the Peter inside of you, and He is asking, does He have permission to pull Peter out of your Simon? And imagine what your life would look like if you let that happen. Imagine what our families could look like if we was a bunch of Peters relating to us rather than a bunch of Simons. Imagine what's at stake if we say no tonight. And imagine what could happen if we all said yes. The good news for us is it's not about us, it's about Him who's calling. It's not about where you are now, it's who you could be in Him. It's not about where you are as Simon, it's about Him looking at your Peter and saying, I want that person for the world to see. When I look at Matthew chapter 14, I see Peter getting out of the boat. And perhaps what's less important of what happened when he was walking on the water is it's just Peter took a step out the boat. And when Simon was in the boat, it was Peter who walked on the water. And in today's gospel, Simon made a choice to be the person that God was calling him to be. And in the boat that you're in right now, God is looking at you and He is saying, come on out. Take a step out. Are you ready to be the person that I've called you to be? Get out the boat. At the end of Mass, we'll talk about how the Diocese of Houma-Thibodaux is ready to walk with you with a new resource to help us all take that very first step. But perhaps the first step isn't with the resource that's coming through strategic planning, but perhaps the first step is literally out of the pew. When you step forward for communion this morning, when you step out of the pew, and when you walk forward, you're not walking toward a priest or an extraordinary minister of the Eucharist. You're not even walking toward a sacrament or a piece of consecrated bread. You are walking toward a person, Jesus Christ, fully present in the Eucharist. And the same person that called Peter is the same person who's calling you in the Eucharist. As you step forward to this morning to receive the Eucharist, are you ready to step out of the boat and to say to Him, I am ready. I give you permission. Yes. Your amen this morning is not simply to a ritual that we go through every Sunday or every time we go to Mass. No, it's a new invitation this morning. Are you ready right now in your life? He is looking at you, Simon, and He is calling the Peter out. Are you ready for all that He might do in your life? Are you ready to become the person that He's called you to be? This morning, as you step forward for the Eucharist, are you ready for Jesus Christ to pull the Peter out of your Simon?